Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining me on Putting the Horse First. For you today, I have part two of my discussion with Steph Bradshaw. She runs a business called Steph Equestrian in Missouri. She got her bachelor's degree education in Canada and then a whole lot of education in addition to that. She is a positive reinforcement and force free trainer. She does rescue, rehabilitation, and rehoming. She is an ethical equestrian coach and trainer. And in addition to all those things, this lady knows her stuff really well. She goes into detail here describing her jackpot method for training cooperative care. So if you're a barn manager or a horse owner and you need some real nitty gritty detailed information on how to get your equine to cooperate for things that you need to do that they don't necessarily want to cooperate with, I think you'll really enjoy this podcast. We list at the end her website and social media. She's at Steph K Equestrian on Facebook, and I hope you all enjoy. Thanks for listening.
The timing goes is making sure while we're under this lens of horse care, especially from like a barn owner or manager or caretaker perspective, making sure that you're managing boundaries appropriately. And when I say you, I'm not necessarily talking specifically to you, but to any listener as well.
Okay.
So just a general vague you, just to clarify that. So making sure that like boundaries are being managed effectively. If you have to train someone's horse, you should be compensated for that. Unless you can set up whatever situation you want with your clients at your facility. But typically, if it's a problem that it's like, okay, I'm spending all this time teaching their horses to do this cooperative care, well, really, either you should be getting paid to train the cooperative care, or maybe that needs to be like incorporated into the boarding fees or whatever you need to do to make sure that you have the ability to set aside time for that. Or that's the responsibility of the owner. And that's something that's a boundary that I hold at my facility is if I have client horses here and they need specialized care, if I have to train them for the care or I have to take that extra training time, then I am compensated for that training time. So otherwise, it's either the horse stands nicely and participates and already has the behavior and knows what to do, or we can sedate them, or it's on the owner to do that. If the owner isn't willing to either pay me to train the horse themselves, or pay for sedation so that the horse is cooperative, then I can't really help them, but I can't give away my time for free. I don't have the time and I don't have the resources to be doing that. And so making sure to have appropriate boundaries there, that in and of itself, it makes a world of difference for barn owners and caretakers in making sure that you are being properly compensated for your time and you have appropriate boundaries. So then you aren't running around frantic and stressed all the time, taking care of other people's horses and taking on responsibilities that really aren't yours to be carrying. So when it comes to the practical aspect of handling horses, and we'll go ahead and start with that situation of the emergency situation. And that's one that gets brought up all the time. And I will tell you, we have had horses injured at my facility. It does happen. I'm going to knock on wood here. We haven't had any serious injuries or anything like that, but we have had like some like cuts and scrapes that have blood on them. We have gotten wounds in the summertime, which requires special care because of the flies that we have locally will cause infections and whatnot. We have horses that need sunscreen in the summertime. We have horses that need daily supplements or meds. And sometimes we have horses come up with injuries or whatever that aren't handleable, like horses that aren't halter trained and are completely feral. And a good example, my baby horse Spud, before she was halter trained, before she knew how to do any formal training, she got a pretty serious injury on one of her knees. So she had a pretty serious injury. It needed to be examined by the vet, and we determined that it wasn't going to get sutures or anything like that, but they were going to leave it open to drain. But we had to flush it and then coat it with a disinfectant and then put alu spray over the top of that twice daily for about 3 weeks straight. And once again, this is a baby horse that does not know what a halter is, has never been introduced to a halter, kind of follows my hands around as though it's a nose target, but mostly just because that's where the cookies come from.
Gotcha.
Like, she has not had any formal training, a handful of formal training sessions. And she needs all of this. And I am a big fan of letting the babies grow up slowly. So she's not like a teeny weeny baby. I think she was around a year old at that point, or between 1 and 2 years old. And she's just lived happily as a horse. And we've just done a handful of training sessions, just very casually. And she's mostly just spent her time learning how to be a horse and how to be happy as a horse. And that's not something that I can teach her. So I don't need to be involved with that process. And so I brought her up and just pulled her outside of her pen, and I put her on a bucket, and I conditioned the noise to be a bridge signal, and I was able to flush her knee, coat it in disinfectant, coat it in alu spray, and we did all of this. I think the first session where she learned all of this was probably 20 to 30 minutes. And then each of the follow-up sessions were just however long it took me to get the care done. And we did it every single day. It was like twice daily for a week or two, and then daily for a week or so after that. And she, over time, the magic with clicker training is that the more we did it, the more willing she was to have it done. Like, she never fought us on it. And this whole time, she also never, actually towards the end is when I started to introduce halter training, since we were doing a bunch of work together anyway. She never put a halter on. She was never restrained, never anything, but we were able to do all of that cooperative care, no problem. And that was like emergency cooperative care. That wasn't something we got to prepare behaviors ahead of time. That was just, oh, the horse is injured, got to take care of it. And we did so entirely force-free positive reinforcement. And it was also super efficient. So now that I've probably piqued your interest enough, I'll talk to you a little bit about how I do that. I'll have to go into a little bit of detail here to get to tell you everything you need to know to do it. But basically, the vast majority of my cooperative care I do on a self-reinforcing station, which just means a station that delivers the reinforcement on its own. So that could be a hay net, a bucket. And oftentimes we have barrels, and we just pour feed on the top of the barrel. And that way the horse can eat at with their head raised up off the ground, so they can still see around them really clearly and be more engaged with the training, versus if their head is down on ground level and they're lifting their head up and down all the time. Basically, they have this reinforcement station available to them, and then I'm implementing my jackpot system in order to reinforce their cooperation. So the SKE jackpots method is a differential positive reinforcement schedule, which basically operates on the assumption that we are going to give some sort of cue or antecedent, and then the horse is going to give one of 4 different behavioral responses that are going to earn one of 4 different types of reinforcement. So the best option that they can give us is the most desired behavior. So that means, or we'll go ahead, I'll explain the first 2. So they're either going to give us the higher preferred behavior or the lesser preferred behavior. A lesser preferred behavior is anything that is safe, that is doable, but isn't quite what I was looking for. That could be a calm default behavior. That could just be an incorrect approximation, like they're making the wrong guess. I want them to turn their head left and they lifted their head up or down or whatever they did, right? So they just didn't quite get the answer right, but they're still trying, or they're just politely declining by offering a calm default, but they're being safe, they're engaged, they get the lesser preferred reinforcement. Now, if they offer a higher preferred behavior, they're going to get the higher preferred reinforcement. So the higher preferred behavior might just be the end behavior. Like if they already know the behavior, then they just get the high value reinforcement the whole time they do it. But if we're shaping behavior and we're trying to teach them the behavior, then essentially when they make a jump, when they make an approximation in the right direction, they earn that higher preferred reinforcement. So oftentimes I do what's called the trail mix method. So I'll have some alfalfa chaff, like some chopped alfalfa hay, and I put a little bit of senior feed in it. And then I have another bag that has pure senior feed. And so the alfalfa with a little bit of senior feed is what we call the trail mix. And I believe it was Abigail Greenwald that said, you eat the trail mix to get the M&Ms. So that's their lesser preferred. And then the senior feed is their higher preferred. But you can do this with whatever feeds you want to be giving them. A lot of my clients will do alfalfa and Timothy in pelleted forms, or a normal hay and then an alfalfa hay, or whatever two varieties you want to do, as long as one of them is higher preferred by the horse and one of them is lesser preferred. And then the only other qualifier I usually say is always use a food that you can give unlimited amounts. You never want to feel like you have to be stingy with your reinforcement, because if you feel like you have to be stingy for nutritional purposes or financial purposes or for whatever reason, that is going to come through in your training, and it is going to frustrate your equine. So always be feeding something that you can just shovel out handfuls of without worrying. And that's one of the reasons that I use the chopped alfalfa hay. We get a nice organic chopped alfalfa that is low calorie, low sugar, so it does well with everybody. And then the senior feed is an insulin resistant, like it's intended to be a complete meal replacer for senior horses that can't chew very well, that are insulin resistant or have metabolic issues. So this works well for my minis, for my insulin resistant guys, my laminitis cases, all the way up through my thoroughbreds that could just inhale 10 times their body weight in alfalfa and still be a little ribby. Regardless of nutrition, it tends to work well. So we're operating on this schedule of higher preferred, lesser preferred.
Okay.
And then there are two other types of behaviors horses can offer during a training session. The first one is disengagement. So if the horse disengages, I disengage. And I do that for two reasons. First of all, best case scenario, your horse is disengaging because they just are so distractible and they just happen to have gotten distracted. And I'll go ahead, I might sound a little skeptical here, and that's because if you have a bag of food attached to you and you're handing them food, there's not much that will distract a horse from a bunch of free handfuls of food. So oftentimes what's really happening is displacement behavior. The horse is choosing to disengage from you and engage with something else in an attempt to look busy because they don't feel comfortable interacting with you anymore. It's the same way, like if you walk into a gas station and some creepy guy tries to make eye contact with you, you might start looking at all the candy bars and you're like, wow, look, those candy bars. And you might even pick one up and like read the nutrition information on the back of it. You had no intention of buying a candy bar, but you're just trying to look busy to avoid an interaction, right? And horses do the exact same thing, and that's displacement behavior. So oftentimes when a horse disengages, it's because they don't want to engage with you anymore. And if that's the case, then by also disengaging, you are respecting their consent cue. You're respecting them saying, no, I don't want to engage. And that is going to make them more comfortable with further engagement in the future. Looping back to that best case scenario, best case, your horse genuinely did just get distracted. And if you follow them around with cookies or you try to call them back to you, then they learn that they just go around doing whatever and you will chase them around handing them cookies. And so even if your horse doesn't mean it in the way of displacement, but is just disengaging for whatever reason, I don't want to teach them to disengage by reinforcing it. So instead, I just disengage from them. But then the vast majority of the time, if they are disengaging from you, it's probably displacement behavior. And so by disengaging from them and just giving like a neutral response or lack of response, you're allowing them to have that space and to say no when they need to. And then they're going to feel more empowered to say yes once they come back to you. And then lastly, the only other type of behavior that can be offered is unsafe behavior. So unsafe behavior ideally should be prevented. So we want to try to prevent these situations from happening in the first place. However, life is life and we can't always see the future. So professionals that have been in the industry for a while, we can usually tell when a bad situation is approaching. And so we're able to do a lot more to prevent, but especially like casual equestrians that aren't as familiar with horses can easily get into dangerous situations. So when a horse offers unsafe behavior, I end the session and I leave. And I do that for two reasons. First of all, I need to reevaluate because clearly something has gone very wrong that I am now in a situation where my horse is offering unsafe or dangerous behavior. I need to leave and rethink my entire approach because whatever I have been doing has led to danger and that's not okay. So I need to back up, leave the situation and try again once I've rethought my methods and rethought my approach. The other reason that I do this is because it teaches the horses that those behaviors are completely off limits and they're not acceptable guests. So when we're training horses, particularly with positive reinforcement, we are relying on them trying out new behaviors and trying different approaches. And so we want to encourage them to explore different behaviors and try different things. But there are also certain behaviors that are just dangerous around people, and we can't have them trying those behaviors. And I think when you continue to train them through those behaviors, it's almost a little permissive. That word might be a little harsh. It sort of demonstrates to the horse that they can try that. You can try kicking at me, and this is the consequence, whether you have a punishment-based approach or just a lack of reinforcement or whatever. But regardless, the horse now knows, okay, that is an option. It didn't work in this situation, but they're going to hold on to that and maybe try it again in the future. With my horses, anytime there's anything remotely approaching unsafe behavior, I end the session and I leave. And really quickly, they learn that that's just not how we interact with people. And so they don't try those unsafe behaviors and they don't attempt anything close to those unsafe behaviors because they know that that's not how they interact with people. So that is the summary of the jackpots method. The SKE jackpots method will have that schedule that you have your jackpots and then you have your lower value reinforcement. And as long as they're engaged in trying, they are being reinforced. The quality of behavior or the specific behaviors are that's what's going to determine if they get the jackpots or if they just get the standard or lower value. But as long as they're engaged in trying, they're getting something. And then from there, first of all, it builds a ton of try. Like the horses stay super engaged the whole time and they really enjoy the puzzle. It's definitely a lot more clear. There's a lot more clarity. The horses aren't having to guess. If they don't get a click, was it because they did the wrong thing or because they should have done more duration, or should they try something different, or should they do a more extreme, like a higher approximation of that same behavior? There's just not a lot of clarity there. And so with this method, it's a lot easier because you can say, yes, that was the right thing, or not quite, try again, but in a way that's positive reinforcement both times. So that's a summary of the jackpots method. Does that make sense so far?
That makes total sense. Yes. A little bit more. So there are definitely more details than what I've been doing there. Yeah. Okay, cool.
So, once your horse is familiar with that system, I typically, when I'm doing this, I have two different bridge signals. So I have a single click and a double click is usually what I use. Can you hear the click of my pen when I...
Yes.
Can you hear that? Okay.
Yep.
So for example, like a single click would be, and then a double click would be just two back to back. It's distinct enough the horses recognize them. So a single click means you're going to get the standard value, and a double click means you're going to get the jackpot value. And once they recognize those bridge signals, they become very clear communication for the horses. So whenever I'm doing an active training session and I'm wanting the horse to engage with me or move around, I'm going to have both types of reinforcement on my body. Like I'll be carrying two bags, and we'll do our training session. The vast majority of the cooperative care I do is done at a standstill. So the horses are standing still, and then I am needing to do some sort of care. So there are kind of two different approaches you can have to cooperative care. You can ask the horse to actively participate in the interaction. That would like to put their mouth on the syringe and take the medication, versus asking them to cooperate passively, which would be like asking them to stand still while you place the syringe in their mouth to administer the medication.
Yes.
So both ways can be completely consent-based. The level of consent is not higher with the active participation than it is with the passive participation. You can easily coerce a horse by restricting access to food or using excessively high value food, and have a horse who hates the syringe and hates what's going on placing their mouth on top of the syringe. Yeah. And you can also have a horse that is completely tolerant and just standing there passively while you place the syringe in their mouth, but that knows that they can turn their head or give whatever cue, and you will completely back away with the syringe, and it's completely consent based. So
Gotcha.
that's something I like to make really clear, because sometimes I think there's this mentality of like, unless your horse puts their mouth on the syringe themselves, it's not really their choice. And I don't think that's the case at all. Choice comes from the ability to say no, and choice comes from the ability to say yes. But you don't necessarily have to teach your horse to put their mouth on the syringe. You can also teach them to hold their mouth still while you put the syringe in their mouth. And teaching them to hold still is one behavior. Teaching them to take a syringe in their mouth and to hold their head or like put their head onto the ointment, or put their eyeball on the eye drops, or doing all of these cooperative care things where you have to teach the horse to do a specific behavior for each type of cooperative care. That does involve a lot more training. Whereas teaching the horse to stand still while you do whatever, that's one behavior. And once you have that one behavior, you're not teaching a new behavior, you're generalizing it to a different type of care. Whenever I teach cooperative care, I teach it on a self-reinforcing station. So I give them a station. I typically use a bucket, whether it's like a barrel, so that then their head is at like the normal level instead of being down on the ground, or maybe I'll just give them a bucket on the ground. And I'm going to fill that with our lower value reinforcement. And then I'm going to have the jackpot reinforcement on my body. And what I'm going to do is they're going to stand there eating at their bucket, and I am going to reinforce them for standing still and just for being there. So I double click and I toss jackpots on top of the lower value feed. And the cool thing about horses is that they don't have great concepts of object permanence.
Okay.
Meaning
Gotcha.
that you can just deliver the feed on top of the other feed and it's still effective. And that's something that I wasn't sure about when I first started, but it's certainly been the case, is that even though I'm adding the jackpots on top of the standard feed and it's all getting mixed together eventually, I'm still seeing effective behavior change. I will say, though, they have to recognize the jackpot bridge before you start this process. So I typically teach them by hand delivering both, and then I introduce the bucket. Once we're introducing the bucket, essentially I'm just reinforcing them, the jackpots, just for standing still. And I start by just moving around their body and standing in all sorts of different positions. And I'm just jackpotting them for standing still. They're also naturally, they're just going to want to stand there and eat their food because that's the easiest thing to do. The first thing I'll do is I'll build a consent cue. If they raise their head away from the bucket, if they turn their head away from me, I am going to match whatever they are doing with my body. So this is kind of like the remote control car negative reinforcement exercise, where you're letting the horse decide where your body is. So if they lift their head up or turn their head away, then I am going to either pause, take a step back, lean back, or even take a few steps back, depending on the level of movement that I got from them. So that is their no cue. That is their stop button. That is their way of saying, I don't want to do this anymore. Or I want you, it's their way of saying, I want you to take a step back. So the horse can do that from the very first time they step foot near that bucket up until the most advanced cooperative care behaviors we ever do. The cooperative care bucket is always a place of consent. If they lift their head up or turn their head away, I back off. And that is our agreement from the very beginning. So they have the option. And of course, they also have the option to leave or to go do something else if they want to. They're never physically restrained at the bucket. I do 99% of our handling at liberty. Once they have that general behavior down, then we just start doing tactile touch. One thing that I think there's a big misconception with clicker training is the idea of thin slicing being within the human's control. We do not get to choose the slices. We get to accept the slices. So the horse decides, the horse offers, and we accept. So sometimes we get it in our head, I'm going to touch his neck and then I'm going to touch his shoulder. Or let's say I'm going to touch his neck and then I'm going to touch his ear. With some horses, you might be able to do a neck touch and then do an ear touch, and that's no problem. With other horses, It might be, I'm going to hold my hand up next to your neck. And then I'm going to hold my hand up a little closer to your neck. And then I'm going to barely touch your neck. And then I'm going to touch your neck a little harder. And then I'm going to touch an inch further forward on your neck. And then a centimeter further forward from that. And then we're going to go 1 centimeter at a time until I'm near your head. And then I'm going to start to touch your cheek. And then I'm slowly going to move up. And eventually we get to the ear. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that those thin slices, and I think this is where there's that misconception that clicker training takes all these steps, because sometimes you need to do all the steps, but sometimes you can make big jumps. And knowing when you can do that and when you can't, that is not something I can tell you. That's your horse gets to decide that, because it's whatever your horse offers. If I can pet them and they are saying yes and they're fine with it, then that's what I'm reinforcing. But if they have to get used to the movement of my hands, if physical touch causes them to say no, then we're going to start with just moving my hands around and we're going to build up to physical touch. So same thing goes for any cooperative care practice. If I need to put ointment on them, putting ointment on them means I put the ointment on my hand and then I touch it to the part of their body that's injured. So I might be able to walk up to them and just do that and reinforce it. But I also might need to thin slice it. So I'll put them on their bucket and I might start with, and typically I will start with just, can I touch the area? Can I touch nearby? Yes. Awesome. I reinforce it. Can I touch a little closer? Yes. Awesome. I'll reinforce it. And at any point I might find a place where, oh, that's the slice we have right now. So we need to start there and get that solid before we move forward. But if I'm okay to move forward, or once I've trained that, then we'll keep moving forward and we'll head towards, okay, can I touch the area? If I can touch it, then okay, now can I put my hand near you while the ointment's on it? Because now it looks different, smells different. As long as they're okay with that, then it's okay. Now I'm going to touch you with the ointment. And we're just going to build up to it. Letting those slices, like letting your horse decide or letting your horse offer whatever they're comfortable with behavior wise, that's what decides the slice. And then not getting it in your, getting like stuck in your head that like, oh, I need to do the next criteria is going to be this, because that's where you can get really stuck. Like, let's say, for instance, are you familiar with like basic target training?
Yes.
Right. Like you have the stick target. Yeah. So I see this a lot where it's like, okay, I'm going to hold out the target and I want my horse to touch the ball on the end of the target. And they start by touching the stick and you take that at first. You're like, yeah, that's a good first step. And then the trainer decides, okay, now the only way to get the treat is to touch the ball on the end. And maybe the horse reaches out and they touch halfway between where they were and the ball. So they're actually making progress towards what you're wanting. They offered that approximation, but you have decided the ball is what gets the click. So you don't click it. And then the horse goes, oh, well, that was the wrong offer. So then they try going for your hands and then that doesn't work either. So then they try going for your bag and that doesn't work either. And they try the stick again and that doesn't work. And now you have a really frustrated and confused horse. Whereas if you had clicked for the approximation that they offered, they would have gone, oh, okay, let me try it in that direction again, and then eventually made their way over to the ball. And of course, if you're doing the jackpots method, then they're still getting the low value reinforcement for their attempt, which makes it so that way they aren't getting frustrated because there's no withholding happening when they get the answer wrong. So that's essentially how I do a lot of the cooperative care stuff, is going to be on the self-reinforcement station, offering the jackpot reinforcement for their cooperation. And then I'm just going to approach slowly so that I can thin slice as needed if they are nervous. Another thing to keep in mind is offering plenty of resets if you do have to shape anything. So typically, I don't want to make more than one criteria jump without doing some sort of reset. That might just mean like switching sides. But ideally, that means like they walk a lap and go do something else for a minute. And it can be as simple as like walk 10 feet forward, do a different behavior, and then walk 10 feet and reapproach the behavior again. You know, they might just step away from the bucket and then step back to the bucket. But a little bit of physical movement goes a long way. And then that way, that's another thing that's frustrating to horses is they touch the stick and they get a click. They touch the stick and they get a click. They touch the stick and now no click happened. And from the horse's perspective, they don't know what happened. They don't know what changed. And we know that we decided now it's time for a higher criteria, but they have no way of knowing that. And so instead of changing the rules mid-game, start a new round of the game, walk away and then reapproach. And now we've got a new round. We can change things up a little bit because it's a different approach.
Gotcha.
So using those resets, and you will save a ton of time doing that, because then you also aren't just like taking and taking and taking, because that can make them very suspicious. If they're like, I don't want you to touch my ears, and you're like, that's fine, I'll just touch your neck. And I'll touch a little closer and a little closer and a little closer. They can start to get really suspicious and hesitant. Every time you do those little approximations, you end up touching my ears, or you end up like going to that thing I don't like. So do a little bit and then do a reset and let that solidify, and then do it again. And the reset doesn't have to be overnight. It doesn't have to be a whole day. It can literally be walk in a 10-meter circle and then do it again, or walk 10 feet forward and do it again. So using those resets will save you time. I think that's most of the stuff you need to know for approaching cooperative care. You can, of course, prepare behaviors ahead of time, and that's super useful. So things like farrier handling, basic face targeting and body targeting are like, those are all super useful. Conditioning your horse to accept sprays and ointments and different objects touching their body, that's all super useful. Body handling, like physical touch all over, those are all behaviors that can help prepare them so that you have those ways to communicate, and they have like certain precursors to cooperative care interactions already conditioned and ready to go. But then most importantly, one thing that helps a ton, and is probably the reason I was able to just pull Spud out as a feral little baby horse and dress her wound and flush it out and do all of that without her even knowing what a halter is. That's because I have an optimistic learner. So I don't know if you've done any studies in cognitive bias, and like cognitive bias testing.
I don't think so. No.
Okay. So it's basically this idea of a learner being optimistic or pessimistic is one of the common ones that we talk about. A pessimistic learner is going to anticipate aversive interactions, whereas an optimistic learner is going to anticipate pleasant interactions. And that is based on learning history and based on previous experiences and context clues. But when you have an optimistic learner and then they encounter an aversive, they are more resilient to the aversive. So if you have a horse that, like Spud, who has only ever had happy, pleasant interactions with people, the first time I spray her with alu spray, or I start spraying a can of alu spray, she's like, whoa, that's weird. But she's not necessarily going to assume that I'm about to cause her pain or distress, because why would she? I've never caused her pain and distress before. So this is new and it's weird, and it might even be a little uncomfortable or unpleasant, but she has so much history with me being pleasant and fun, and I'm approaching her as though this is a pleasant, fun time, and I'm giving her food and I'm relaxed. So she's going to have this cognitive bias in place that she assumes that it's going to be okay. Whereas a horse who has experienced harm at the hands of people, who has experienced painful interactions and all of that, they are going to anticipate that that new thing is probably going to be bad. If in the past a spray bottle that's a little unpleasant, a little uncomfortable, I don't really like that noise. And then the feeling of it spraying them, oh, I don't really like that. If that's something that's introduced in the context of a pleasant, happy, positive reinforcement relationship, you're going to get a situation like Spud. But then think about the majority of the traditional interactions horses have with that. It's, I'm going to spray you with this, and if you fight, I'm going to restrain you. And if you fight through the restraints, I'm going to use more harsh restraints. And if you fight through that, I'm going to run you or hurt you or punish you, or however I want to correct that behavior, right? And that quickly conditions them to anticipate, if something is a little scary or a little uncomfortable, or you're not quite sure about it, you better be really scared, because it's only going to get worse. So having a learner that is optimistic makes it so much easier to work with them versus having a pessimistic learner. And that's where a more holistic approach to their mental well-being and their expectations and associations with people can really go a long way with getting ideal behaviors and making things like cooperative care more doable. If they aren't having harmful or aversive interactions with people outside of cooperative care. And that's one of the things that we really rely on, especially like injections training. My horses stand at liberty for their injections. And
nice.
I think I have a video up on my social media from when we did spring vaccines. I just go out in the fields and I put a bunch of food down on the feed. We have these like mineral stations, and I just pour feed on top of the mats that cover the station, and the horses sit there and eat, and I just walk around and I do vaccines for each horse. And they're completely cooperative, because even though there's this one little aversive thing that's not super fun, they know that the vast majority of things with me are good. And so they know that even when a horsefly happens to bite them, or if I'm talking with my hands and their face is right there and I accidentally swing my hand towards their face or bop them in the nose or whatever happens, they know, oh, that was just an accident. That was a one-off. It's not going to escalate into a hugely traumatic experience. It's not going to escalate into this giant painful interaction. And they also know that if they don't like what I'm doing, they can just walk away. And so that really makes a world of difference. When the horse is terrified that they're going to have to fight and that they're not going to be able to leave, they're going to panic so much quicker, versus my horses are very willing to kind of stick around and figure out what's happening, because they know if they get uncomfortable, they can just leave.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's definitely a big issue. I'm often dealing with horses who've been wrestled, so as soon as they see the syringe or something, like, they know what's coming. I mean, sometimes just taking them out of the stall is all it takes, because they've had people try to corner them in the back of a stall and wrestle them so much. Just take them out of the stall and their anxiety level goes down by 80%.
Yeah.
Well, that was a lot. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back and re-listen and take notes for all those. That was a lot of details. But thanks for all that information. I really appreciate it. It's so great that people are coming out. When I went to college, it was like equine science degree and stuff. And I spent 1 year at an equine college, and it was a joke. I mean, when I say joke, I mean a joke. I mean, there was 2 classes. There was a class split immediately. The people who came with their own horse kept their horses in the show barn, and those of us who did not, we groomed for them. And there wasn't much. I mean, there really wasn't much value in the program, period. I was only there for a year, and then I switched to a larger university. But now I see people coming out. These animal behavior degrees are worth so much more, and people are learning so much more than the equine studies degrees that were being offered 20 and 30 years ago. So that is so great to see. So before I let you go, do you want to tell us about your website or how people can get in touch with you? You said you offer online courses. Do you do courses that people can do at their own pace? Or do you do like individual coaching, or you have a mix of all those things?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you go to my website, you can find me on social media under Steph K Equestrian. And my website is skequine.com. And it's got all the information about the different programs I have. I have in-person education programs here at my facility in Missouri. And then I've also got virtual education options. You can do one-on-one virtual coaching and consulting. You can also take my online course, which right now it's like a live Zoom course. And I'm hoping by the end of the year to have the self-paced courses up and running. It's one of my goals for going into winter is getting that going. And then that way people can do like the self-paced education. Yeah. And there's all sorts of info about all of that online.
Are people submitting videos, or are you doing live stuff by Pivo?
So I typically try to avoid the live lessons if I can. Oftentimes we end up having to pay way too much attention to the technology, and it really takes the focus off of the horse and sort of takes away from the training. So instead, I prefer to do video review. So we can just talk and go over things back and forth how we're talking right now. Pictures worth 1,000 words, and videos are made up of thousands of pictures. So if possible, I usually recommend that people submit video if they feel comfortable doing so. And then I review the video, Sometimes I'll send back like a voiceover where I talk as I like draw pictures over the video and like speak to specific frames. And then we also have, I usually at a bare minimum do a phone consultation where we can talk over my thoughts and what I saw and give feedback. And then typically along with the feedback I give, I also give exercises for things to try, sort of like next steps or next criteria to look for so that you can proceed forward and keep working towards whatever goals you have.
Well, thank you so much. I've kept you here for a while. It's been nearly an hour and a half, so I will let you go. But I appreciate you showing up for me and my very little podcast, which now only has, I've got 10 episodes I published, and I think I've got 4 that I need to edit right now. So very nice of you to come and talk to me when I'm unknown. And I just went on one of the positive reinforcement pages. I said, does anybody want to come and talk?
No worries at all. No, I really appreciate you giving like this type of media a voice. And I am not good with the audio editing. So I'm always happy to speak on other people's podcasts because then I don't have to do the audio editing.
Gotcha. Good. Okay. So, well, you've obviously got so much practice at presentation that yes, the editing should not be too hard at all because yes, you've put this out there many times. I can tell. Is there anything else you want to say before I let you go?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Cool. No. All right. Great. Thank you so much for being on my podcast. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Let me know if you have any questions, want to chat some more. And you're of course also welcome to use any of those resources on my website or any of the virtual stuff, that you want to.
Thanks again for listening, everybody. If you want to reach out with feedback or questions, you can shoot me an email at puttingthehorse first@gmail.com. Thanks a lot.